Section 5. Moral Beauty, Motives, and Obligations. The distinction between natural and artificial virtues can safely be taken as Hume presents it, as a distinction between those virtues which are always morally good, independently of any particular circumstances, and those which, because they are a rational response to the exigencies of particular circumstances, only have value given those circumstances, and only achieve their end when part of an interdependent system of like actions. However, this leaves the problem of explaining why he saw the distinction in terms of the natural and the artificial. Why not, more simply, put the matter in terms of the simple and the complex, or of the individual and the social? After all, he allows in both the treatise and the second inquiry that justice, because it is necessary to, or inseparable from, human life, can be correctly described as natural. Why then does he not esteem it natural? What is it about a virtue founded in reason and reflection that makes him unwilling to call it natural? Answering this question successfully requires an understanding of Hume's view of virtue in general. This is, in some respects at least, a difficult task, since in the treatise he says little of direct relevance to the topic, and what he does say can prove more of an obstacle than an aid to interpretation. However, the problems can be significantly reduced if we return to the question of the structure of the treatise, Book 3. That issue is particularly pertinent here because Hume's general remarks on morality are very largely contained in the brief first part. To understand the place of Part 1 in Book 3 as a whole is thus to become capable of conducting further inquiries more successfully by knowing where to look for their solution. As suggested above, one of Hume's main aims in Book 3, Part 1, is to show his colors on a dispute familiar to his readers, the controversy over the apparently competing claims of reason and the moral sense as the foundation of morals. His further aim is to show that, despite being manifestly the correct viewpoint, the moral sense theory is not a sufficient foundation for our moral convictions. In fact, it shows some of our convictions to be quite paradoxical, most obviously those concerning justice. The task of Part 2, Hume's principal contribution in the area of moral theory, is to remove these paradoxes. If this picture is substantially correct, Part 1 is very brief, not because it is unimportant for his overall position, but because of its relation to Book 3's main purpose. The purpose, to resolve a problem generated by moral sense theory, requires no more than a brief introduction, a sketch of the main outlines of that theory, including its most apparent strengths and weaknesses, in order to pose the problem to be discussed in the body of the work. In other words, moral sense theory slips from view in the later part of the book, in part because the work is a contribution to, or refinement of, moral theory. This is only apparently paradoxical. Intellectual inquiries conducted within a particular framework or paradigm do not typically refer to the paradigm. If a work is directed at an educated audience, it is directed at an audience who can be presumed to know the point of the inquiry and thus not to need more than minimal reminders. In any intellectual dispute, the key to understanding lies in recognizing what is not being discussed. This is a requirement often easily satisfied, but it is always more problematic when investigating the meaning of historical texts. If the purpose of Treatise Book 3 Part 1 is principally to situate the discussion, any opaque or obscure Humean remarks can be clarified by an appeal to the unstated background, which in this case means by consulting other moral sense writers, or by considering central features of the moral sense viewpoint. Of course, this needs to be done with care, since the moral sense theorists are not all of a piece. This applies especially to Hume, since Part 3 of Treatise, Book 3, clearly shows him to be aiming to sophisticate the moral sense position, not merely to repeat it, by explaining the notion of moral sense itself in terms of the operation of the more general psychological principle of sympathy. As long as this constraint is not forgotten, Hume's less transparent remarks can be examined in the light of other moral sense theories. And, no less importantly, the same insights can be employed to educate our approach to the second inquiry. In that work, the term moral sense does not appear at all, but it retains the commitment to found morals in sentiment or feeling rather than reason. And this, as Treatise, Book 3, Part 1 shows, is the distinguishing mark of the moral sense position. Furthermore, if Hume attributed misinterpretations to a failure to recognize his commitment to a broad moral sense perspective, he could be expected to make this and other non-skeptical commitments more visible in his later work. This he does, as will be shown more fully below. Hume's central argument against the possibility of founding morals in reason is that moral considerations move us to action. This reason alone cannot do, because it allows only the discovery of truth or falsehood. It is essentially passive, and so can neither move us to action nor determine ends. All it can do is help us to select the best means to any given end. Ends themselves are ends only insofar as they are desired states, so all ends are founded in passions, with reason the instrument to their effective achievement. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. The same point, put less colorfully, is that all reason alone can never be a motive to any action of the will. So, if unaided, reason cannot influence the will. It cannot provide the foundation of morals, since moral considerations do influence the will. As reason can never immediately prevent or produce any action by contradicting or approving of it, it cannot be the source of the distinction betwixt moral good and evil, which are found to have the influence. Moral distinctions, therefore, are not the offspring of reason. Reason is wholly inactive and can never be the source of so active a principle as conscience or a sense of morals. It deserves to be emphasized that for Hume, moral awareness is an active principle, that there is an essential connection between morality and action, not least because in some places he appears to undermine the connection. The distinction between anatomist and the painter at the close of the treatise is a case in point. Persuaded himself of the activating role of sentiment in the morals, Hutcheson complained of the treatise's want of a certain warmth in the cause of virtue. Hume's defense is to appeal to the different roles of the anatomist and the painter, but he apparently came to accept the criticism since, in the second inquiry, not only manifests a good deal of warmth in the cause of virtue, it also implicitly undermines the value of the anatomist-painter distinction. His concern there, he says, is more the speculative than the practical part of morals. But he also adds that the end of all moral speculations is to teach us our duty. If this is so, then the moral sentiments have a place to play in the study of morals itself, since reason alone cannot reveal to us our duty. It can only reveal means to an end, and thus possible duties, but it cannot select between different achievable ends. So to teach us our duty, the study of morals must call on both reason and sentiment. And since to call on sentiment is to excite it, warmth is a necessary part of the study of virtue. If it is further added that there's little point to teaching virtue unless it is tied to the promotion of virtuous action, the conclusion is strengthened. This appears to be Hume's own assessment. At least, he becomes very conscious of the importance of promoting the appropriate sentiments. Extinguish all the warm feelings and prepossessions in favor of virtue, and all disgust or aversion to vice. Render men totally indifferent towards these distinctions, and morality is no longer a practical study, nor has any tendency to regulate our lives and actions. It should be said that the context of this passage shows Hume to be presenting a possible view, a view that he does not identify as his own. However, it seems most likely that it is his own, or at least the sort of view he would defend. If so, he accepts that the writer on morals cannot properly extinguish all warm feelings on the matter. Moreover, on this view, warm feelings naturally arise in connection with morals because of the active nature of morals itself. Hume hints at the connection when he speaks of that which renders morality an active principle and constitutes virtue our happiness and vice our misery. This connection between activity on one hand and happiness or misery on the other exists because we are moved to action by sensations, or conscious prospects of pleasure or pain. As he puts it, the chief spring or actuating principle of the human mind is pleasure or pain. Desires and aversions, happiness and misery, are real or imagined pleasures or pains which we see to be connected either to ourselves or others. Since passions move us to action, and since pains and pleasures are the source of passions, then we are moved to act by pains and pleasures. In Hume's language, pains and pleasures are motives to action. Moral motives, in turn, are pleasures or pains of a particular sort, and for this reason, Hume insists that morality is more properly felt than judged of. And, since the subject matter of morals is the actions or characters of human beings, moral approbation is precisely the feeling of pleasure generated by the contemplation of a certain sort of character or action. By the contemplation of a character or action, Hume means the recognition of the principles in the mind and temper, the qualities or durable principles that the character or actions exhibit. It is feeling that moves or activates us, but what we approve of in any act of moral approbation is not feelings, but the durable motives displayed by others in their actions or characters. Hume's aim is not to reduce morality to mere feeling, but to explain the psychological mechanisms of moral reality. It is in this spirit that observations like the following are best understood. We do not infer a character to be virtuous because it pleases, but in feeling that it pleases after such a particular manner, we in effect feel that it is virtuous. The case is the same as our judgments concerning all kinds of beauty and tastes and sensations. Our approbation is implied in the immediate pleasure they convey to us. It remains to explain what it is that makes approbation, in any particular case, moral approbation. Given the foregoing account, it must be a pleasurable feeling generated by contemplation of a character or action. However, since the contemplation of manifestly non-moral, even immoral characters or actions can generate pleasure, the question is how moral contemplation or moral pleasure is to be distinguished. Hume does not answer the question directly, but it is not difficult to determine his position. The clue lies in another of his short summaries of the basic facts of moral psychology. He says there that virtue is distinguished by pleasure, and vice by the pain that any action, sentiment, or character gives us by the mere view and contemplation. In the immediately following sentence, he speaks of the reaction produced in us by an action viewed from the general view or survey. It is most likely that the expressions, the general view or survey, and the mere view and contemplation have the same meaning, and that the meaning is disinterested contemplation. Moral pleasure is thus distinguished by the fact that it is caused by an action or character when perceived without regard for any advantages or disadvantages that the action or character has for the observer. It can be described as the pleasure caused by the action or character considered for its own sake. Our sense of self-interest or advantage causes us to be pleased by actions or characters that benefit us. Moral approbation is the pleasure caused by actions or characters considered independently of our interest or advantage. At this point, interpreting Hume is substantially assisted by calling on the moral sense context. While his remarks do suggest the type of interpretation offered, it is Hutcheson who frequently stresses that considerations of interest and advantage can contaminate or overrule moral perceptions, and that moral perceptions themselves are entirely disinterested. For example, he describes moral good as our idea of some quality apprehended in actions, which procures an approbation and love toward the actor, from those who receive no advantage by the action. For this to be possible, for disinterested contemplation to produce pleasure, moral qualities must exhibit a kind of beauty, because beauty is the quality possessed by objects that can cause disinterested approbation. The distinctive beauty of the action or character motivates our actions. The author of nature has much better furnished us for virtuous conduct than our moralists seem to imagine. He has made virtue a lovely form to excite our pursuit of it, and has given us strong affections to the springs of each virtuous action. Hume's view is similar in essentials. He differs from Hutcheson in his assessment of the strength of the disinterested affections, as shown by the stress he lays on the limited benevolence of human beings. He thus backs away from Hutchesonian strong benevolence, but without defecting to the camp of self-love moral theorists. His position is, in other words, a medium between extremes, just what should be expected from a man of moderation. It is now possible to sketch in the general outlines of the moral sense view of the nature and practice of morality. A characteristic concern of this outlook is the close connection between moral judgment and action. The task of moral philosophy is thus understood to include not only an account of the nature of moral goodness, etc., but also of the sources of moral action, of what makes moral thought and action a practice characteristic of human beings. And because of his particular concern with the efficient causes of action, this latter issue features prominently in Hume's moral theory. So a central purpose of the following sketch is to show the nature and causes of a characteristic form of human behavior.